Now, what I'm going to do is for the next minute, I'm basically going to just give you a refresher on what we're doing and where we're at, and then I'm just going to dig right in and see how far we can get in this video. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm building a contact list application using React, and I'm doing it in a test-driven development way. So what that basically means is I come up with the requirements, I write the tests for those requirements before I write the features themselves, and then I write the code that will make the tests pass. And it's kind of a little bit of back and forth in between. So that is what we're doing now. Where we're at in the last stream, what we did was we created a contact modal that allowed me to basically input information and call a submit function. Now, we haven't written any tests for the higher order component that contains this, but all of the tests so far are in here in this contact modal. Now, what I'm going to do right now is somebody in the comments of the last stream actually informed me that we don't need to do this anymore. We don't need to call this cleanup function. It gets called automatically. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that. That's the first thing I'm doing. And the second thing I'm doing is I'm going to wrap all of these tests inside of a describe. And that allows me to group all of these tests in a way that's kind of like logical, because I'm going to have another set of very similar tests and a separate describe for the edit case. So right now what we've created was the create contact case. So I'll create a describe block here and paste in all of the tests that I wrote in the last stream. And then in here, I'm just going to say create contact. Now, these are all of the tests in the context of creating a contact. We're going to have to do similar tests for editing a contact. I'm going to reuse the same component for editing. And basically, this is the way that I'm thinking about it. We're going to have a submit function. Now, the higher order component that contains this contact modal component is going to have two different scenarios for rendering this particular component. There's going to be the edit case and the create case. In the create case, we're going to pass in the submit function where it's going to store that in like local storage or something, and we're not going to pass in a contact. In the edit case, we're going to use the exact same component, but the submit function is going to be a different function, and it's also going to contain a new prop called contact. Okay, so this is going to be an optional prop. Like, we're not going to pass this in certain scenarios. So I'm adding this here. And what I need to do is, I'm about to write the tests for it, but basically, just so we're on the same page, is we are going to, as we initialize this state here, we're going to check whether or not we've passed in a contact. And if we passed in a contact, we're going to set each of these equal to that contact's information. Otherwise, we're going to set it as an empty string. So keep that in mind. Just want you to understand that before I start writing the tests. Now, I have someone in the chat that just said, "Hey, Port, I don't understand what you are doing. Put me in the F context, please." So at the very beginning of this stream, I explained exactly what I'm doing and what I did in the last stream. So if you are confused, just go rewind, watch the beginning, and then jump back to the live. All right. So I'm going to continue forward here and start writing the tests. So just because it's going to be easier for me, I'm going to write this at the top. So we're going to have another describe, and this is going to be for editing contact or edit contact. Edit contact makes more sense here. And I'm going to basically copy each of these tests, but in the different context, basically, of edit instead of create. So instead of initializing an empty form for edit contact, we would expect initialize this form with contact info. So in order for this to work as we expect, we need to pass in a contact, right? So if you remember, I just added this contact prop. It's going to be optional, and I'm going to say the contact here is going to have 3 properties: name, which we'll just say like Joe, phone, which will just be like 987-654-3210, and then email, which could just be test@gmail.com. So I'm rendering a contact with a, I'm running the contact modal with a contact prop. So now what I would expect is for these to have those values. Instead of empty strings, I would expect them to have those values. So Joe, here's the phone number. So the name should be Joe. This should be the phone number. And then the email should be test@gmail.com. Then we would expect there to be no errors, but instead of the submit button being disabled, I would expect it to not be disabled because now all the inputs are, they're filled in. So obviously I'm going to expect this test to fail because even though it looks like Cenobite offsec, hopefully I pronounced that right, is now following me. Thank you. So I am accepting the contact as a prop now, but we're not doing anything with that. So I would expect this to fail. And I don't really know if in the React testing library, if I can do this, but I feel like I should be able to say only, right? And then I should only be able to, basically in most testing test runners, you can add this only thing and it's going to run only the tests within that context. So maybe I can do that. Let's find out. So SkyD says, what is the advantage of TDD compared to normal development? I will explain that at the end of today's stream, so stick around. There's a lot of reasons why you would want to understand and use and apply TDD, but stick around to the end of the stream, and I'll answer your question along with anybody else's. Okay, as you can see, it said 1 test failed, 5 skipped 5 because I have the only here, and it failed because I wanted it to fail. It makes sense that it would fail because I haven't written the feature yet. And that's what TDD is all about, right? You write the test for the requirements, what you would expect to happen. You run the test and it would fail because you haven't written the code that makes that happen. Then you write the code that makes it happen, and then the tests should pass. So what we do here is we're going to say if contact exists, specifically contact.name, then do that. Otherwise, pass in an empty string. And this is just... hold on. Let me go ahead and fill this out and I'll explain it. So I'm short-circuiting here and I'm using optional chaining. So basically what this is saying is if there is a such thing as contact.name, then set it as contact.name. Otherwise, short-circuit out and set it as an empty string. So that might be all I need in order to get this test to pass. Let's find out. And it indeed worked. So it was that easy. And that's why I like TDD. Another thing I will quickly say is, like, again, I can't render out a to-do or a contact list right now because I don't have the actual contact list component. All I have is a contact modal. And what's great is that I can write this code before I can ever see it on the screen. And so that allows you to work on features before other features. So typically without a test-driven development model, you would have to have some way of displaying this on the screen, right? You would have to have some sort of way to test this out manually as you write the code. Well, with test-driven development, you don't have to do that. You can work on this feature before you work on the feature that this requires. And that allows teams to work more quickly because they can work on features at the same time. There's a lot of benefits, but I'll get more into that at the end. Okay, so what other tests do we want for the case of edit contact? Is there anything else really? Let's look at the tests for create. Is there anything different? Enables submit button once form is valid. So that's kind of already tested in this one because it's valid right out the gate. Disables the submit button when fields are invalid. Displays error messages for invalid inputs. I believe that should that should be it. So that was really the only test for edit contact that I can think of right now. So I think we're good with the edit case. So what's next? I think next we're going to work on the contact list itself. Now, the contact list is going to be responsible for displaying all of the contacts that have already been stored and added. There's going to be an edit button and a delete button, but the contact list component is not going to be responsible for the actual logic of edit and delete. Instead, what it's going to be responsible for is calling edit and delete, whatever those functions may be. So it's not going to care what edit is. It's not going to care what delete is. All it cares is that it calls those functions, whichever ones are passed to it. Okay, so what we're going to need to test is that the contacts are displayed as we would expect, that we pass into it, and that edit and delete are called, but completely ignorant as to what edit and delete are. When we write tests for the higher order component that contains these components, that's when we're going to care about the actual logic, and we'll write tests for that. That'll probably be the very last thing we do. And it's funny because doing test-driven development, we're doing this backwards, right? Normally, we would have to write that higher order component logic in order to be able to write these other components. We don't have to do that because we have a test suite that allows us to do this. So I'm going to go ahead and take a moment to create the contact list component. So bear with me for just a moment. I just got to get this boilerplate out of the way. Okay, I think I got everything here. Let's see. Okay, I think we're good. So, what I'm going to do is start off by talking about how I'm going to render everything. I'll add the proper props within here, and then I will move over to the tests and start writing the tests. So what I want to accept within this contact list component is two callback functions. So we're going to have onEdit and onDelete. And then we will need to have, and we'll probably call this onEditClick and onDeleteClick, just to be more specific. And then we're going to also need an array of contacts. That's probably it that I can think of. So we're going to say onEditClick, onDeleteClick, and then we're going to have contacts, which is an array of contacts. And I just, for now, want to return the word contact list, and that's what this component will return for now. I'm going to quickly run into my prettier config and see if I can set this a little bit lower so that it goes to the next line. Okay, cool. That way you can see everything on the screen at once. Maybe 75 would be better. Nope, it's got to be 70. All right. So let's start writing some tests. Now, I'm going to go to my contact modal and just get this, like, these imports right here. Make this easy. And obviously, instead of contact modal, we want contact list. And I don't need a describe here because we're only going to have one particular context for these tests. So I'm going to just write these tests at the global level. And if that changes in the future, I can easily wrap them inside of a describe. So what's the first thing we want to test? Let's say it renders a list of contacts. And yeah, let's just start with this most basic test. So to kick this off, we're going to need a list of contacts. This is going to be an array of objects. And each object is going to have a name an email and a phone. Getting plenty of questions in the chat. I will be sure to answer all of them at the end of the stream. That's kind of how I've been doing this lately, is just answering, like taking a good 20-30 minutes at the end of the stream to answer everybody's questions. So keep leaving them in the chat. I'm not ignoring you. I'm looking at them, and I will get to them at the end of the stream. So for this, I just want to have, let's just say 2 contacts for this test. So we have 2 contacts. Now let's render out the component. And pass in the contacts. Now we're going to need 2 other functions, right? On edit and on delete clicks. But we don't care about that in this test. We're not going to do any of that in this test. So I'm not going to pass them in as props. Now, what we're going to expect is 2 rows of data in a grid. We're going to expect 1 row with Joe's information and another row with Bob's information. So how can we test this out? There's 2 really ways that I can think of. There is the way of just saying this information should be on the screen. You could say there should be the word Joe on the screen. There should be the word, the string test123@gmail.com on the string. There should be this on the screen, etc. That would work, but it's not specific enough for me, because I want to make sure that this is on the same row and that this is all on the same row, and that somehow they're not mixing or, you know, being displayed in a weird or odd way. So I think that what I will do is every contact should have an ID. So that's just kind of like a standard practice anyway, right? Just having IDs for chunks of data. I think I'm going to add an ID to every contact. So in the case of Joe and Bob, it's going to be ID 1 and 0. In the real world app scenario, we're probably going to have a UUID. Now, how I'm going to use these IDs is I'm going to give these, I'm basically going to use the IDs as a, as like a unique identifier on the actual DOM element itself as well. And then I can grab that DOM element for a given ID and say, this information should be inside of that particular DOM element. And that way we're being more specific. All right. So just keep that in mind for now. And the way that I'm going to grab those is, let's say I grab the first 2, which there's only going to be 2 in this case, right? So const Joe row, I guess we could call it. What is the best way to do that? Let's say screen dot get by, how do we want to do this? A test ID? Or, yeah, let's do it by test ID. So we're going to dynamically give these test IDs maybe. Yeah, okay. So let's do get by test ID. And we're going to say contact 0. 0 is going to come from this ID. Now, Bob row will be the same concept, but with 1 instead of 0. Now, I'm pretty sure these are going to return HTML elements. Yeah, so it's going to return the div that has this test ID. And from within that, I should be able to say expect Joe row dot to have text content. Sure. And I can even go a little bit more specific and say within this, there should be a name column, a email column, and a phone column, and then check those individually. But I'm not going to be that specific in this case because I don't think that's entirely necessary. I just want to make sure that they're on the correct rows. So we're going to say to have text content Joe, and then check for the email and the phone. And then I will do the same thing for Bob. And then this should be the phone number. Just verify that. Okay. All right. So this should obviously fail, but I think I still have the only on here. I need to get rid of this only on the describe from this test. Then I can close that file. Okay, this should be correct. This should work. Now, this is going to fail immediately because I have yet to do anything. I have yet to write the code. So it fails as expected. Now, it's time to write the code. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to grab a div, or we're going to create a div, give it a class name of styles.main, because this is going to be the container for everything within here. Need to import styles. Then this div is going to have, it's basically going to map, right? It's going to map through the contacts. So contacts.map, and for every single contact, we're going to render a div. So we're going to say C, which is short for contact, and then we're going to grab the index. So in here, we'll say we have a div that we're going to render. Each of these divs is the rows. So we're going to have a row for every single contact. Now, we're going to need to give it a key. And for the key, we can just give it something like this. Let's say row hyphen and then the index. And I'm going to put this on a separate line to keep everything a little bit visible. If you remember how we were grabbing these for the tests, we were doing the data test ID. We're getting by test ID, and we have contact hyphen slash contact hyphen and then the ID. So let's add a test ID here. So data hyphen test ID. And this is going to be a dynamic test ID that starts with contact hyphen and then the contact.id, so c.id. Now the actual content within a row. So there's 3 columns per row. So let's just grab these, make a copy. So the first one is c.name. The second one will be c.email, or let's do phone. And then the third one will be c.email. What happens here? So the test just passed, right? So it failed, and then it passed because I wrote the code for it. So all that's happening here is we're looping through the contacts, and we're displaying the information. Great. So what's the next requirement for the contact list? The next one is that you're able to call the edit button when you click it. Like the edit button should be should call the function that we pass into it. So let's create another test. Oops, that should be a semicolon. And, whoa, what's going on here? So let's say calls the edit function when edit button is clicked. So let's start by rendering some contacts. Actually, for this, we really only need to render one contact. So I'm just going to render Joe here. And we're going to need to pass in an onEditClick function. And all we need is a function to pass into onEditClick. So let's say const edit fn function, fn is short for function. And let's say jest.fn. So this is the function that we're going to check to see if it was called. So let's say edit fn. And now we're going to need to fire an event on the edit button. Okay, but there isn't an edit button for a given contact yet. So for every row, we're going to have to render an edit button. And I think we can use the same kind of pattern that we used in this test to get by ID. So we have the ability to get a row by ID because the test ID would be like contact hyphen and then the ID of the contact. Well, if we could do the exact same thing for the edit button. So let's say we have a reference to the edit button. So const edit btn Joe is equal to screen.get by test ID. And the test ID would be edit hyphen btn hyphen and then the ID of that user, which is 0 in this case. I said user, I meant contact. So now we have a reference to that particular edit button. Let's fire an event on it for click. So fire event.click. We want to fire that on the edit button, and that should call the edit function. So after you click on the edit button for Joe, I would expect the edit button to have been called with Joe. Now, this is where we're going to get where things are going to get interesting. So right now, this test is okay, but I'm going to want to make sure that it gets called for the contact that I clicked it on, right? So let's say we render 2 contacts out. We have Joe and we have Bob. If I click the edit button on Joe, I want to make sure that the edit button was clicked and Joe was passed in as the argument instead of Bob. So I don't 100% know how to do that yet. I'm going to have to look that up, but for now, what I want to do is just make sure that this part works. Obviously, it's going to fail right now because I haven't written this code yet, but I just want to get this to pass, and then I'm going to add that additional requirement in just a moment. So we can say expect edit function dot to have been called. So I bet you to have been called with is what I'm going to have to use in order to determine that it was called with the proper argument. But I don't know for sure yet. So let's just get this far. So the test should fail. Cool. So it failed. And it looks like the dot only doesn't work for this level, this scope here. It just runs it for the entirety of this file. So that's kind of a shame, but there's probably a better way to do that. But anyway, so let's make this test pass. So at the end here, we're going to have 2 extra divs. We're going to have one for the edit button and one for the delete button. The first one of these 2 is going to be the edit button. So that's all I care about right now. Edit hyphen btn hyphen and then c.id. And for now, we're just going to render the text edit. Now, technically, I don't need to give this a test ID. Perhaps I could just grab it from, like I could just grab the row and then grab the edit button from within that. But for now, just going to keep the test ID. Keeps the test code a little bit more simple. But we're going to have to pass in an onClick function, which we have here. It's called onEditClick. Now, specifically, we need to call onEditClick with the contact that we clicked on. So we're going to pass in C. Okay. So let's see if the test passes. The test passed. Now we want to just make sure that we're calling it with the proper contact, right? So let's see how this on to have been called with works. Let's see how this works. It says it takes ensure that a mock function is called with specific arguments. Optionally, you can provide a type for the expected arguments via a generic. Note that the type must be either an array or a tuple. So that's for the type. But let's see if we can just pass in a object here. And there's only one item in contacts, so I could just say contacts 0. So it should get called with this object, right? Let's find out if this passes. I want to make sure that it fails first though, right? So I'm going to add a second item to this array. And let's say it should fail if we expect it to be called with contacts 1 because we're clicking on Joe. We're clicking on Joe in the test. So if I say I expect the function to get called with Bob, then I know that would fail, and I want to watch it fail because I want to make sure that my tests are working. So let's watch it fail. Okay, it failed. Now I'm going to get rid of this, and I want to make it pass. So hopefully this passes. Excellent. So now I know that my test is working as I want it to, and as I write tests, especially in a TDD way, I like to do that. I like to make the tests fail to make sure that the tests are working as expected, because sometimes you might think that a test is working as expected, but then you try to make it fail and it still passes, and you're like, huh, okay, well, you may need to tweak something to make it work as you were thinking it would. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to copy this entire test block here, paste it below, and do the same thing for the delete button. So calls the delete function when the delete button is clicked. And instead of edit function, we're going to call it delete function. Instead of passing on edit click, we're going to do on delete click and call delete function. The delete button, again, just changing the variable names here to match what we're doing. Okay, so that should fail because we don't have the delete button. So in here I can copy this, and we're going to have the delete button at the very end. So the text should say delete. On click, we're going to say on delete click. And then instead of edit here, we're going to have delete. Excuse me. Let's see if this passes. All right. So it says 2 passed. Oh, 2 suites. Okay, yeah, perfect. So that is everything that we want for the contact list. I think that we just successfully completed the contact list. I can't think of anything else we need for the contact list off the top of my head. Okay. So what's left? And if I forgot anything for the contact list, I will come back to it. But for now, I think we're good. So what is left? Okay. The higher order component. So we need to go where we're going to be rendering all of this and start writing the tests for how we would expect the actual app to behave. So how are we going to do this? Okay. Let's do it. Let's create a new file called app.test.js, and let's get the boilerplate. Get the boilerplate kind of set up for the tests. Okay, let me think about this for a second, because the app component is going to be as follows. We are going to have the contact modal, and we're going to have the contact list rendered on the screen using this app component. But there's going to be conditional logic that hides and shows the contact modal depending on whether or not the add contact button has been clicked. If the add contact button has been clicked, we would expect to see the contact modal on the screen. And if we add a contact, like if there's contacts in local storage at a given time, we would expect to see those contacts in the contact list. Excuse me. So we're going to have state in here that is going to keep track of that. So what we need to test is a couple of things, but I think the easiest thing to do is to start with showing and hiding of the contact modal. So shows contact modal when add contact button is clicked. Let's start there. And we already have a test ID for the contact modal, right? So let's look at the contact modal and look at this code. We have a test ID for the form. The test ID is contact modal form. So what we'll do is we'll render the app component. After we render the app component, we would expect there to be no contact modal form on the screen. So let's start by saying that. So screen dot query by test ID, and then the test ID was contact modal form. So we would expect that to not exist on the screen, right? So expect this dot not to be in the document. So initially when we render the app, we should not see the contact modal. Then what we'll do is we will click the add contact button. So let's do that. Let's say fire event dot click, and we're going to call that on. Let's grab a reference to the button. Const add contact btn is equal to screen dot get by test ID add contact btn. We're going to call click on that. After we click that, we would expect this to now be in the document, right? And since we're expecting it to be in the document, I'm going to actually use get by test ID here. The second time around. I'm using query the first time because it's not going to be in the document, and it will throw an error if I use get, so I'm using query. I'm using get the second time because it should definitely be in the document at this point. So let's write the logic to make this this test pass. Of course, I want to make sure that it fails first. Should get an error. Good. Let's make the test pass. So for this, we're going to have some state called adding contact, set adding contact equal to use state, initialized as false. Then within here, we're going to actually have a parent div that contains the entire application, which will be class name main, which means I need to import my styles. And I think I need to actually add the styles file. There we go. Okay. And then from within here, we're going to have a conditional check here that says if adding contact then we want to go ahead and render the contact modal. So now that test might pass. It didn't. It says unable to find an element by add contact button. So that's working as I would expect so far. So let's add the add contact button, add contact. Then on click, we would say that we want to set adding contact to true. So now it should pass. And it didn't. It says get by test ID add contact button. So I have to add the test ID. Data test ID add contact btn. All right, now it should definitely pass, guaranteed. All right, so it passed. Very good. And doing this, this dot only is doing absolutely nothing for this, so that's a shame. So the first test is passing. Now, just writing that test and getting that to pass made me realize something, which is we have no way of canceling. We need to be able to cancel adding a contact, right? So if I click add contact and then the contact modal shows up and then I'm like, you know what, never mind. There's no way to get out of that. So I need to be able to have a cancel button for the contact modal. And then we're going to have to write a test for it. So we're going to have cancel as a prop that we're passing in, and then we're going to add another button next to submit called cancel. And this will never be disabled. And if we click on it, and this needs to be of type button, otherwise it's going to possibly submit the form, which we don't want. So on click for this is going to be the cancel callback. So this is where I'm going to save this, and we're going to find out if I've introduced any regressions, because I just added logic to this component. And when I save it, if all of my tests pass, then I know that I didn't introduce any regressions, and that's going to be good. So let's find out. No regressions were introduced by adding the cancel button. Very good. Now, let's click that cancel button. So first, let's add a test within the contact modal test. So we'll quickly run down here, and under this test, we'll add a new test that says calls cancel when cancel button is clicked. We'll just render, I'll copy all this, and we'll render this out. Let's take a minute here. So I don't care about any of this. I don't care about any of that. I don't care about this stuff. So what I would expect is I need to create a reference. So const cancel fn is equal to jest.fn. And then let's say, instead of getting a reference to the submit button, we're going to get a reference to the cancel button. And we're going to get by text cancel. We're going to click on it. So fire event dot click cancel button. And we should expect cancel function dot to have been called. See if this test passes. This says it failed, and it says calls cancel. And okay, where is it failing? So it just never got called. Now the reason why is because we didn't pass in a cancel function. So this cancel function needs to be the very first thing that we define in this test, and then we need to pass this in as a prop for the cancel prop. Now it should potentially pass. All right, it passed. Cool. So that was the first thing. Now we can go back to this test and say, so the first test was shows contact modal when add contact button is clicked. We're going to say hides contact modal when cancel button is clicked. Now, let me just copy all this because we got to show the contact modal in order to click the cancel button, right? But let's see. So we expect that to be on the screen. Now let's click the cancel button, fire event dot click on the cancel button. So we're going to create a reference to the cancel button really quick. So const cancel btn is equal to screen dot get by text. Cancel. And I probably should give this a test ID, because what if the person's first name is cancel or something like that, right? So what if in the contact modal there is something called cancel, which I don't really have to worry about now that I think about it, because I am in full control of the data that's in the tests. So I don't really have to worry about that weird thing to happen, that potential crazy bug. Since I'm in control of all of the data, since I'm writing these tests, I don't have to worry about there being some crazy edge case or something like that. So I can grab it by just the test and not have to worry about that weird edge case. So got a reference to the cancel button. Let me put it after this. We're going to call click on the cancel button. And then we would expect this to not be in the document anymore. The modal should be hidden. Okay. So that should fail nicely. There you go. It failed. So let's pass in a cancel function to our contact modal, which is just going to set adding contact to false. That should cause the tests to pass. Good. Very good. Okay, next test. So we're able to show and hide the contact modal, but we should also, when a contact is added, so when submit is called, we should close the modal afterwards. So it should automatically close when we submit a contact, right? So let's write that requirement. Closes modal automatically after submit. So I'm going to basically copy this test here. It's going to be a little different. So instead of clicking the cancel button, I'm going to keep this because we're going to need this in a minute, but I'm going to get rid of this. Instead of doing that, I'm going to fill out the information. Now, the easiest way for me to do that is to actually go to the contact modal test and like kind of copy some of what I have here, since I already have the logic for filling out the form. So I'm going to copy this, paste it here, and then I'm going to, let's find the one where it just like submits the form cleanly. One second. I don't see that one, but let's just go ahead and fill out the form. And 1 second, let me clear my throat. I'm sorry about that. Still getting over the cold. Almost fully healed though. All right, so phone input, that's the first one. We're filling out the phone. Second one, email. We're filling out the email, test123@gmail.com. Instead of the phone input, that's email input. Then we're going to fill out the name input, which will be first. So name input. And we would say Joe, I guess. Now, mental note really quick. We have the concept of IDs for users, but we're not creating any IDs yet. But that's okay, because what's going to be in charge of creating the IDs is actually going to be this app component. So we're going to have to write a test for that in a minute. So I'm just making a, like an out loud mental note. So we fill out the form. And then the final thing we need to do is fire an event on submitting the form. Which I don't have a reference to the form here. I'm just grabbing one really quick from my old test. Come on. Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? There it is. Okay, so here's a reference to the form, and then finally we're going to fire an event of submitting the form. Okay, so once we submit that form, we would expect the contact modal to no longer be in the document. So quick refresher on what we just did. We are rendering the app. We're expecting the contact modal to not be there. We're clicking the add contact button. We expect the contact modal to now be there. We are then grabbing references to all the stuff in the form. I don't need the submit button. We're filling out the form, and then we are submitting the form. And then now once it's submitted, we would expect the contact modal to not be there. Okay, so that's going to fail. Usual pattern here. It fails. We write the code. It passes. All right, so in the app component, we need to make this happen. So for the contact modal, The submit right now, all it's doing is it's saying console.log submit. Well, now we're going to actually have to have some sort of submit logic. But we don't care about that yet because we haven't written the test for it. But what we do care about is that it closes the modal. So I'm going to actually console.log the contact that we filled out. So this submit function needs to accept the contact, which we'll use C for short, and we're going to console.log the contact, and we're going to then set adding contact to false. So now that test should pass. Okay, cool. And at console.logged undefined, because we are not actually passing that in the contact modal, we need to do that. So for the submit, we are calling submit here, but we need to call submit with the actual contact. So we need to get the object here, and we're going to call it with name. Oops, didn't mean to put a colon there. Name, email, and phone. And name, phone, email. Okay, cool. So now I'll run the tests again. They passed. I just want to make sure it logs the contact. So there it is. So getting closer to being done here. Okay, so the next thing we want to test. Whoops. Let's see, what is the next thing we want to test? Well, let's say that it actually does something when we submit a contact. It should actually store the contact in, we'll say, local storage, right? What about mocking local storage? So this component, the app component, what it's going to do is it's going to, every time we add a contact or every time we read from the contact database, we're going to use local storage to store that information. And that's awesome, but we should probably mock local storage so that we can control the data that's being stored in our tests. So I'm going to have to look up how to do that. Local storage, mocking, React, testing, library. Testing local storage with testing library. All right, Daniel Afonso. This is the writer of this blog article. And the way, excuse me one moment. The way that they are doing this is they're basically overwriting the local storage object on the window and kind of like creating get item and set item. They're basically creating their own version of local storage. Let's see if we can copy this same kind of methodology here. Let's give it a shot. Now, makes me wonder where, so he's putting it in the before each. Okay. All right, let's give this a shot. Let's see if this works. So I'm going to need to do a different mock for different tests. So for now, I'm just going to start by putting this inside of the test. So what is it we're testing? We're saying properly stores submitted users. And for set item, in the case of storing submitted users, I don't really care about what it returns. I just want to make sure that set item gets called. So let's see. So let's go through the process here of submitting a full user, which we do in this test here. Pretty much just copy all that junk. And now for the set item, we're going to expect a contact, right? And yeah, so I'm going to just do it like this. And basically what I'm going to do, I'm kind of thinking in my head, when I need to be thinking more out loud for you all. But I'm going to expect set item to get called with Joe's information. That's basically what I'm trying to do here. So let's say we would expect this to no longer be in the document. And we would also expect, and I don't know if this is going to work, local storage dot value dot set item to have been called with that information. And window dot local storage dot set item dot to have been called with, and I'm actually going to create an object here at the top called Joe, and it's going to have a name, an email, and a phone. And I'm gonna actually use this as reference. I'm gonna say Joe.phone, Joe.name, and Joe.email. And I'm gonna go back up here and set the name to Joe, set the email to test123@gmail.com, and then set the phone here. Then down here, I'm going to say to have been called with Joe. Okay. I feel like this is the right way to do this. It will fail now, so I actually have to go in and do the local storage dot set item. And we're going to set the item with the contact that gets passed in here. But we also need to have an ID, right? So let's, interesting. How are we going to test that? That's going to be an interesting one. For now, I'm going to ignore IDs just for a moment because I need to see if this even works. Okay. So we immediately, it says expected document not to contain element, but it found it anyway. And the reason why is unknown to me. But again, I'm really just trying to see if this works. So I'm going to comment that out for a moment. Wow. So we are getting an error. It says failed to execute set item on storage. 2 arguments required, but only 1 present. So it's actually not overwriting it the way that I was hoping it would, because set item here, like we should be overwriting it. But it's expecting the arguments that the actual local.storage in the browser expects. So then I would guess it's not actually overwriting it as I thought it would. So I'm going to quickly look and see if there's a better way. Or maybe I missed something. They're doing it the same way that I am doing it. They're doing it the same way. Where... So maybe let's just do it. So let's say set item. We'll actually pass in the key. Let's say, oh, and this does need to be stringified, but I still don't understand why it's requiring, I don't know. So let's say contacts. So strange. So it worked a little better, kind of. It says number of calls once, so it was definitely called, but it was not called with the data that we expected. Instead, it received this. So let's say we go back. I think this is going to work, everyone. I think I figured it out. So I would expect it to be called like this. Does that work? Awesome. Okay. Got it. All right. So this should be closing the modal as well, right? Yeah. All right. Got it. Amazing. So that properly stored the submitted users. So I'm going to actually end up needing to do another test really quick that is going to determine, like it's going to show the contact list, and we're going to have to overwrite local storage to already have data inside of it so that we can pull it out and say, okay, there's already saved items in here. So when we get the contacts, we should expect there to be already an array of contacts, right? So just want to quickly emphasize something. In a real world app, you can't just set JSON in local storage. You have to stringify it. So that's one thing. The second thing is that we don't want to overwrite contacts when we submit a contact. We don't want to overwrite what's in storage. We want to add the contact that we just submitted to the already existing array of contacts. So there's kind of a weird gap here where test-driven development is totally a way we could do this, and I'm going to do it in this video. But in this case, this is one of those scenarios where it might not be best to like build this particular feature using test-driven development because of the nature of this particular feature. So just something to think about. I'm going to do it for this video though, just so you can see how it's done. Okay, so the requirement is that when we submit a contact, it's going to add it to the existing array of contacts in local storage. But what if there is no contacts in local storage initially? So when we first boot this app up, we want to run a little bit of logic here that's going to check if there's anything in local storage for contacts. If there's not, we want to set that as an empty array. If there are contacts, we want to set contacts in state. So we're going to need a chunk of state called contacts, and set contacts equal to use state. And initially, it's just going to be undefined. When we mount the component, when it first boots up, we're going to grab some local storage. We're going to say const stored contacts is equal to local storage dot get item contacts. Now there's two situations here. Either stored contacts exists or it's undefined. So if not stored contacts, so in other words, if this is undefined, we're going to go ahead and initialize, we're going to set local storage, so local storage dot set item contacts as an empty array. And we always need to use json.stringify on whatever we store because we can only store strings in local storage. And then right after that, we're going to set contacts in state as an empty array. Else, if stored contacts exists, we're going to parse it out. So const, or we could just say set contacts equal to json.parse local storage, or just stored contacts. Okay. So when the component mounts, we're just getting the stored contacts. If it doesn't exist, we're setting it. So now we're always going to have an array as contacts in local storage. But again, we don't want to set it. Instead, what we want to do is concatenate it, right? So we want to json.parse stringify, and we want to take the existing contacts, if I can spell, and add the new contact to it. But we're going to reuse this variable. So actually, I'm going to cut this out, and we're going to say const new contacts is equal to all the existing contacts along with the new one. We're going to store the new contacts. And then after that, we're actually going to set contacts in state equal to new contacts. So we're doing several things here. When we submit a new contact, we're going to create an array of the new contacts, set it in local storage, set it in state, and then close the modal. Okay. Now, the test is going to now fail because, well, actually, it might not. Yeah, it did fail. So it's going to fail because we're expecting an array now. By the way, let me comment this out because we're not going to use that yet. I have to get the tests to pass again before I can move forward. Now, let's look. We would now expect an array with Joe in it. Let's see if this works. Oh, and it should also be a string, right? So let's see what it gives us, right? It says, yes. Wait. Received. Yes. Okay, so since the first time it's calling it with an empty array, so it's initializing it. That's another test we need to write. So in here, we're going to say initializes empty array in local storage if no contacts are stored yet. This one's going to be pretty easy to test, so we're just going to mock this. And I can actually, we're going to do a describe. So I want to group these tests because I don't want to duplicate a bunch of code. And I can add it before each in here. That runs this mocking logic. Like that. Describe local storage logic. So these tests are going to be specific to local storage based logic. So I can grab these tests here and put them inside of this block. And then before each of these tests are run, this will end up running. So I don't need that in there anymore. Cool. Now, all we need to do is render the app and then expect, where is it? Expect this to have been called with an empty array. Well, we could do JSON.stringify empty array. So I'm going to comment this last test out because this is still going to be failing, but I just want to make sure that the test I just wrote works as expected. Okay, good. So now we'll go back up here, uncomment this out, and I would expect it to be called with JSON.stringify an array with only Joe in it. Let's see if that passes. I don't know if it passed or if it's just frozen. Yeah, it passed. Great. Very, very good. Okay. Sweet. But this is where things are going to get interesting. We don't want to call it quits on this test yet. We want to add another user. So this last test here, this particular one I'm working on, is unfortunately going to be kind of a long test. So I want to add another user, and I want to make sure that both are, once I submit the second user, that both are actually being stored and that we're not overwriting the previous state. We want to make sure that we're actually concatenating users and not overwriting the entire array. So what that basically means is I have to copy all of this, and in a real world app, I would not submit this like this. I would probably write a helper function that does all of this, so we're writing and duplicating way less code. But I'm not worried about that right now as much as just kind of explaining how all of this works. So I already have references to these. Here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna get rid of the consts because we're gonna reassign those here. So up here, I'm gonna use lets. And I know we're getting into the weeds now, everyone, but bear with me. It's gonna be worth it. So we're gonna need one more contact, right? So instead of Joe, we're gonna have Bob. So I'll just duplicate this, go with Bob here. Instead of test 1, 2, 3, we'll do like 4, 5, 6, and then for the last 4 digits, we'll just do 999999. There. So on the second time we fill out the form, we're gonna use Bob instead of Joe. And then we're going to submit the form. And then finally, it's going to close the modal. And then instead of expecting it to just have Joe or to just have Bob, we would expect both to be in here. Both Joe and Bob should both be in there. All right. Does this work? Yeah. What do you know? So I want to see it fail with just Bob. Let's make sure that this is working as I think it is. I want to make sure it fails with Bob. There it is. Now I know my test is written in a way that makes sense, and my test is passing. So quick review. For properly storing submitted users, the test is creating a user called Joe and a user called Bob, and just objects here. We're rendering the app. We're expecting the modal to not exist until we click on the Add Contact button, in which case now we would expect the modal to exist. We're grabbing references to all the inputs and the form itself. We're filling out the form. We're submitting the form. We're expecting the modal to now not be on the screen because we submitted the form. We're expecting local storage to have been called with Joe because we just filled the form out with Joe. We are clicking the Add Contact button again, so now the modal should exist. We're reassigning the inputs and the form because now it's a new reference. We're filling out the form again, but this time with Bob's information instead of Joe. We're submitting the form. We are then saying that since we submitted the form, the modal should not exist anymore. And now it should be called with both Joe and Bob because we were adding Bob to local storage and not overwriting Joe. Okay. Told you it'd be worth it. And then this test that we wrote kind of midway through that one is just saying that when we first run the application, since local storage is empty for this app, we would expect it to go ahead and initialize local storage with an empty array. All right. That is that. Now, the delete logic. Let's do the delete logic. So for the delete logic, I'm just going to create a function called delete contact, which takes a contact. And what we're going to end up doing is setting contacts equal to all of the contacts except for the contact that we pass into delete. And then we're going to then set local storage with the updated array. So const updated, or I think the naming convention is new contacts, is equal to contacts.filter. And for each contact, we want to check and see if C dot, do we want to do ID? We probably want to do ID. So C.ID, we don't have IDs yet. So C.ID does not equal to, it does not equal, oh, I shouldn't use C here. I should, how do we want to name this? We'll say each contact. Okay, so we're filtering the array based on ID, which the actual application logic has no concept of IDs yet. We're going to have to add that in a moment. Then we're going to set contacts equal to the new contacts array. And then we're going to local storage dot set item contacts with JSON dot stringify new contacts. Okay. in the concept of the tests, we have IDs, right? So I can actually come in here and say ID is 1 or 0 for Joe, and then I can say that the ID for Bob is 1. Now, I'm going to write the test here that tests the delete logic. So test properly manages the deletion of contacts. So in this test, we're going to render the app. I'm thinking. We're going to render the app. I'm starting to think I need to break some of this logic out into a helper function. So all of this logic here that like creates contacts, I don't want to keep writing this and pasting this over and over again. It's going to make these tests absolutely massive. So I need to just add a helper function called add contact where I can just pass in the information here, and it handles the logic of going into the form and adding all of that stuff. So I need to do that. I think I can just pretty much create a function here called add contact, which accepts a contact. And then I can copy all of this logic here. So let's say all the way from, do I want to have the add contact button click as part of that helper? I guess so. Then we're going to go through, copy all of this, all the way up until submitting the form. So this will make sense in a second. So I'm adding all of that logic to this add contact function. Now, instead of using the references for Joe, we're going to do c.name, c.phone, c.email. Then if I go back down here, I can say add contact with Joe. And Joe is not a thing right now, so I'm actually just going to say name. And actually, I will do that. I will say Joe, and I'll create global variables for Joe and Bob, just to make my life easier. Less code to write, less code to duplicate. So Bob and Joe are going to be global variables here. Cool. So add contact Joe, and then I can do the same thing down here for this test. It's going to significantly reduce the amount of code I had to write. So this one is for Joe, so add contact Joe. And then the one down here was Bob. We'll get rid of that. All of this. We'll do the same thing for Bob, so add contact Bob. See if they still pass. Okay, it says that it does not pass. Why might that be? Which part did it fail on? It failed on line 135, so it failed here, which tells me that something about my helper function is no longer working good. Even though, let's see, so we click add contact button, fire the add contact button click, expect that to be in the document, fill out the information. All right, here's what I'm thinking. How long have I been streaming, first of all? Probably a while. this might be a good time to take a break, but let me just, before I do that, let me just take one more look at it. Properly store submitted users. We're on 135 where it's failing. And expected it to get called with this. Oh, you know what? I know what it is. Okay. Maybe I don't. Hold on. I thought I did, but then I realized maybe I don't. Hold on 1 minute. Name. Ah, that's what it is. The ID. Okay. So Joe has an ID in our test, but it's not getting called with the ID in local storage. Which means that the way we're building, I knew this was going to happen. I just wasn't expecting it to happen this soon. We are building the contact in the form, right? So if we go back to the contact modal and we look at how we're calling on submit, we're calling submit here. We need to add an ID. Now, the way that I'm going to do this is by using a UUID. But here's the problem, right? The problem is that we're going to have to control the ID of a user. Because if I use a UUID, it's going to be randomly generated. It's going to be like ABC123 or something crazy. Then within our test, we're not going to know how to do that. So I'm going to have to mock that in here. This is going to be a good spot to stop. We're going to have to finish this in the next stream, but this is going to be the idea. We're going to create an ID here, and we're going to have some function called UUID, which generates a unique ID for every single user we store and submit in the database or the local storage. Then in our test, instead of just hard coding these IDs, or we could definitely hard code them, but we're going to have to, kind of like how we're mocking the local storage down here, how we're mocking local storage, we're going to have to mock a new function called, like UUID, whatever we're calling it in here. We're going to have to overwrite that function somehow to return a value that we can specify within our tests. Otherwise, we will not be able to test this logic properly. So I'm going to leave it here and continue this next time. And let's look at some of the questions. We didn't get as many this time, so I can run through this pretty quick. I already answered this one. They were just asking what we're doing here in this stream. I answered that at the very beginning. So if you're here and you're wondering what the heck's going on, just rewind to the very beginning of the stream. Again, this stream will be available on the YouTube channel. So what's your opinion on Svelte? Svelte is, so a lot of people like Svelte. I personally, I think it's okay. It's fun to code in, but I'm still just going to keep using React because I don't see the reason or anything about Svelte that is that is better than React to me. And since I'm so familiar with React, it's like why learn Svelte at a higher level? So I can't really. I'm definitely not talking bad about Svelte. I think Svelte is awesome, but I just don't see the need for me personally to use it. Sky D says, nice video, followed by, what is the advantage of TDD compared to normal development? So I answered that as well, but basically TDD unlocks the ability to develop features that you normally might not be able to work on in a normal like BDD type way. So what I mean by that is, let's say, kind of like how I'm doing in these streams, there's a feature you want to work on, but you can't display it yet, or you don't have all of the requirements for a given feature yet, but you want to work on pieces of it. You can write the tests that for the requirements and then develop that on the way. And it's also a great way to kind of like get the tests knocked out as you're developing, because you need to write tests for your code anyway, pretty much. So you might as well get it knocked out as early as possible. But there's so many benefits of it. What's your stance on BDD? I actually will save that for another video. Agent 09. Alan Jimenez says, I finally caught one of these lives. Yeah, I'm glad you're here. Thanks for showing up. And then Liam and Amon saying hey. That is it for this stream. In the next stream, I'm going to finish up all of the logic. So kind of like what we got stuck on here, I'm going to finish that, finish all of the logic for the contact list. And either in that stream or a following stream, I'm going to actually display all of this on the screen and do some actual manual testing and style it all with CSS. And this time I'm actually going to make it look good. So keep that in mind. All right, everyone. Thanks for showing up. Hope you all have a great day.